Selo Lipovo na obroncima planine Sijenjevine u blizini Kolašina bilo je u 1942. godini, u 1943. središte štaba Vrhovne komande Jugoslovenske vojske u otadžbini i generala Mihajlovića. Na Božić 1942. stigao je ovde komandant prve britanske misije kod Mihajlovića, pukovnik Bill Bailey, i on je bio stručan za jugoslovenska pitanja. Pre rata je bio on direktora rudnika Trepča, vrlo dobro je govorio srpski jezik i poznavao prilike u Jugoslaviji.
Bili u Lipovu kad je bio na englesko draže? Onaj Bailey?
A da pa ja nisam i bio sam pa one radio stanice njihove kad su zujali, sve sam ja tamo dolazio i sve ih gledao, samo koje je bio engleski, to nisam znao. Bio je jedan, dolazi u Kolašin što ga zvaju Čikamarko, Engles, i on je snimao našu vojsku. Baš kad su krenuli da pale ova muslimanska sela, ova se vojska postrojila ispod štaba na jednu livadu i on je s onoga balkona slikao i snimao ovu vojsku. I kaže, naročito ga zvali Čikamarko, da ne bi se znalo ko je i šta je.
26. februara bilo je jedno krštenje. Tu je Draža, iritiran, gotovo besan, prisustvom Bejlija, rekao da su Srbi konačno ostavljeni od svih svojih saveznika, i Engleza i od Amerikanaca, da se Englezi bore za slobodu Jugoslavije do poslednje kapi srpske krvi, da BBC, zvanična radio stanica britanske vlade, laže, slaveći uspehe partizana i pripisujući partizanima ono što četnici rade, i da dok je takva situacija, njegovi jedini saveznici na koje može da računa jesu Italijani. General Mihajlović bio je besan i zbog toga što je u toku jeseni 1942. godine primio samo 2 britanske pošiljke, ne veće od 3 tone. Čak i u te 3 tone nije bilo onoga što je tražio, već je dobio neko zarobljeno italijansko oružje za Bisinije i jako mnogo protiv otrova za ujed zmija. Ovo je odjeknulo kao bomba prvo u Kairu, u centru SOI, a zatim i u Londonu. William Dickin, koji je docinjen bio šef misije kod Tita, kaže da je ovaj telegram značio prekretnicu u odnosu Britanaca prema Mihajloviću i da od februara 1943. godine britanska podrška počela da slabi, da bi konačno prestala negde uleto iste godine i u toku Teheranske konferencije kasnije iste godine u novembru bila potpuno okrenuta prema Titu i prema partizanima.
The whole business of British fury at Mihailovic's speech at a christening in Lipovo, where he was criticizing the British for their failure to support him and saying, that the partisans and the Ustasha were his main enemies and that the Italians were to a certain extent his friends. I mean, British were absolutely furious about this, and the reprimand that was to be sent was to be enormously strong. And it was sent, and Jovanovic was instructed to criticize Mihailovic, and so on.
From my own point of view, working as I do on the official history of the Special Operations Executive in Yugoslavia, what interests me is the extent to which the British knew about, participated in, and encouraged Mihailovic's collaboration. I should say, first of all, that there's no evidence whatsoever that the British knew about, encouraged, or facilitated any talks which Tito and the partisans may have had with the Germans or Italians. But in the case of Mihailovic, it was perfectly clear that the British knew of the extent to which his movement was involved with relations with the Italians in areas occupied by the Italians, obviously enough, and that they were not, before the early months of 1943, particularly alarmed or upset about the commingling of Chetnik and Italian anti-communist volunteer forces in Dalmatia, Montenegro, and places like that. Later on, the issue of collaboration became a vastly difficult one because it became one of the bases on which the British supposedly determined their decision to abandon Mihailovic and support the communists. In other words, for public consumption, Mihailovic's collaboration had to be emphasized. And this, as I said, was difficult precisely because the British had themselves connived in and supported the notion that Mihailovic might have useful relations with Italians. Of course, the reason why the British had done this was not because they had any particular love for the Italians, but because they drew a very firm distinction between collaboration with the Italians, which was somehow permitted, and collaboration with the Germans, which was never in any circumstances permitted. And of course they did this because they were not themselves in a position to supply Mihailovich with the support that he needed in the crucial early years of the resistance in Yugoslavia. The trouble was, of course, is that the appreciation that grew through late 1942 and early 1943 of the military contribution being made by the partisans, this had the effect of making Mihailovich's previously approved of relations with the Italians completely and utterly inappropriate. And so the British tended to focus on collaboration as one of the reasons why they shouldn't have any further relations with Mihailovich. This is at the end of 43, despite the fact, and this is the irony that I'm focusing on, despite the fact they had previously supported the notion.
Vezujući se za jugoslovensku izbjegličku vladu i za kralja, Mihajlović je morao da prihvata rezone te politike, koji su vrlo često bili određeni rezonima savezničkih odnosa, a ne rezonima srpske stvarnosti. U toj politici vlade, iako se zna za osnovni motiv srpskog ponašanja, a to je genocid, vrlo brzo se nalazi sklad između srpskih i hrvatskih pozicija, kabinetski sklad, koji skoro nije imao nikakve veze sa onim što se dešavalo na terenu.
Croats in the exiled Yugoslav government were, right from the start, on the defensive. They were numerically outnumbered, and obviously with the early news of the Ustasha genocide, they felt even more on the defensive than they had before. They did, I think it's unfair to say they didn't castigate the genocide. They came out on broadcasts and in print criticizing it very severely, but at the same time they did always add provisos, making sure that people realized that the Croats in exile, were not the same as the Croats who were members of the Ustasha. I think they felt, and probably rightly, that the British didn't really distinguish between the two, that the Croat was a Croat, whether it was a good one or a bad one. And this obviously made them even more defensive. But I think it's important to realize that Serbs in the government too were aware that Serbs and Croats couldn't live side by side without some new solution, without a federal solution.
Već u 1942. godini u britanskoj politici dominira ideja o budućoj Jugoslaviji, koja traži da se preskoče stare stvari. U preskakanju starih stvari jasno se uočava simetrija takozvane velikosrpske hegemonije, koja ima odgovor u ustaškom pokretu, u ustaškim pokolima.
So that a Serb mentioning the same piece of news would also perhaps have focused on Serbia, on Serbia's future, just as the Croats in the government were focusing on the Croatian future. I think that's perhaps not unreasonable. The British tried to be fairly even-handed about how they saw Serbs and Croats. It was not something that they knew that much about, and they certainly didn't wish to become embroiled in it. They felt the Yugoslav government was sufficiently divided without giving too much of a sympathetic ear to each one's quarrels with the others.
Well, a collaboration was, of course, not the principal reason why the British abandoned Mihailovich. It was one of the reasons which had to be highlighted for public consumption. It was something that Churchill had to be able to talk about in the House of Commons. The real reason, of course, why the British abandoned Mihailovich, and putting it very brutally, was simply that Mihailovich was not going to be the man who was going to emerge on top in Yugoslavia after the war. He had effectively been defeated in every place except Serbia by the middle of 1943. And it was self-evidently true that his movement was not responsible for holding down and killing as many German soldiers as was Tito's partisans. This meant that the British made a decision almost exclusively on hard-headed military factors. They wanted to support the movement in a country which was of marginal political importance to them. They wanted to support the movement which was killing the most Germans, as Churchill often expressed it. This may be unpalatable. It may be unacceptable for those people who wish to see deeper evidences of conspiracies or political involvements of all sorts of kinds. But certainly I don't see any other reason as overwhelmingly powerful in the British decision to abandon Mihailovich as the simple one of military expediency. He had lost, and he was not going to be able to provide in the meantime the sort of military assistance the British wanted. And of course what the British mostly wanted was containment of German forces in Yugoslavia, particularly forces that might have been used next door in Italy.
Kada govorimo o toj Mihailovićevoj strategiji, onda moramo također da navedemo da je Mihailović suviše bio prikovan za Srbiju. Istina, i šumadijski seljak, kako pišu savremenici, teško se odlepljivao iz svog atara. Mihailović također nije našao snage u toku Drugog svjetskog rata da se bori na dva fronta. Njegov boravak u Crnoj Gori doveo je do jednog plana da se pođe na severozapad Jugoslavije, da se sruše, razbiju partizani do kraja, da se uzdrmaju temelji NDH i da se posjedne zaleđe Jadranske obale prije nego što dođe do invazije. To je taj njegov veliki plan, ali uz pomoć, pod pokroviteljstvom i uz direktnu saradnju sa italijanskim okupatorom. Mi mislimo da je Bailey bio savršeno upoznat sa ovim Mihailovićim pohodom na zapad. Kako je ta zamisao Mihailovićeva prošla, znamo iz ishoda bitaka na Neretvi i Drini u proljeće 1943. Ne možemo na ovu operaciju prema severozapadu gledati van završene bitke u Tunisu i predstojećeg skoka posle konferencije u Kazablanci na Pantellariju ili Siciliju. Mada nijedna od zainteresovanih strana nije znala gdje će praktično doći do tog savezničkog iskrcavanja.
My part in the story is that in October 1942, I was appointed to be the operational officer in charge of our liaison with Yugoslavia, then established in Cairo. And the next important thing that happened was that the Prime Minister, Winston Čerčil, passing through Cairo in January the 30th, 1943, looked at the situation of our liaison with Yugoslavia and decided that the time had come when we must make contact with partisan forces. This decision was taken for military reasons because it was vital to destroy the railway line coming down through Zagreb, through Vojvodina, through Serbia to Sarajevo. And we were not able to get this done by the Chetnik forces, whose policy was not to attack at that time. And so we turned elsewhere. And these orders were given to me, and early in February, and we proceeded to make contact with partisans.
Očevidno je prema njemačkim signalima koje vataju Englezi da se nešto dešava i u zapadnoj Jugoslaviji, gdje očevidno Mihailović nema svoje odrede. Prema tome, u početku treba da uvide šta se tamo dešava. I to su te one druge snage koje oni hoće da vide.
Mi znamo da su Nemci imali celu grupu armija, takozvana grupa armija E, koja je zauzela Grčku i Bugarsku i Albaniju i deo Jugoslavije. To je bilo oko 300 i 350 hiljada odlično izvežbanih i dobro opremljenih vojnika koji bi mogli da engleskim i američkim trupama nanesu velike gubitke da su se recimo iskrcali iza linija u Italiji. Prema tome je najedanput nastao preokret u gledanju Engleza. Ne samo gospodin Čerčil, nego engleski generalštab je najedanput uvidio veliku ulogu koju su partizani imali. Iako su oni bili svjesni toga da narodnooslobodilačka vojska nije bila u stanju da se odupre nemačkim frontalnim napadima sa koncentrisanim nemačkim snagama, oni su znali da mi možemo da im poslužimo kao odlični nosioci informacija. Prema tome, nijedna koncentracija nemačkih trupa nije mogla da se desi na Balkanu, a da mi to ne bismo znali i saopštili Britancima. Prema tome su oni 1943. godine odmah uoči njihovog iskrcavanja u Italiji postali svoje prve oficire za vezu da bi dobili stalne i konkretne informacije.
We had got one great advantage, and that was the internal German signals of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, which were broken in by our people, and through the Enigma, they broke the Enigma machine. The ultra, you know this story, I'm sure. And so I am getting signals, small pieces of signals, which from one SD post to another SD post in Voća, in Kalinovic, wherever it may have been. And from these signals, this patchwork of signals, we built up a map saying probably there are partisan forces here and probably there are partisan forces there and there. Let us hope that we are right. And so this is what we did, and we sent 2 missions, each of 3. They were all Yugoslavs from Canada. They were, I think, many, they were Croats, but they were not chosen because they were Croats, but because they were volunteers to go back on a very dangerous mission. And I said to them, we cannot be sure that we know what you will find. You will have to go blind. But probability is that you will find partisans.
20. aprila u noći ja i 2 Hrvata, Pero Erdeljac i Pavle Pavlić, stariji od mene, ali mi smo bili u misiji Fungus na engleskom. I ja moram da kažem, ja sam mnogo ponosim da sam bio prvi Britanac da se spustim kod partizana u Jugoslaviji. Mi smo bili u civilnom odelu i mi smo se spustili slepo. Inače nismo znali gdje će biti partizani. Jer pre nego što smo pošli, Krugman i Basil Davidson, major, su nas uveli ispred mape i rekli su, tamo nekli su partizane. I because je jedan ogroman kraj oslobođena teritorija.
And it was good guessing, or good work from the map, from the German signals, all coming from German information, German intelligence, because they at once found contact with partisan headquarters in Croatia in one case and in Bosnia in another case. And from that contact came everything else. So they were very brave men, and they deserve to be much praised because it was a very dangerous mission. They fell blind out of the sky. They didn't know who they were going to find, because in partisan war, who is here today is not there tomorrow. So we didn't know. It was guessing and good luck. And they all survived, all 6, I'm glad to say, survived.
Ti oficiri bili su zapanjeni kad su došli u našu zemlju. Jer oni su mislili da se kod nas vodi gerilski rat sa malim jedinicama ili sabotažama koji nekad po noći napadnu tu i tamo. Kad tamo našli su vojsku od oko 100.000 ljudi koja se danonoćno tukla sa Nemcima. Prema tome, oni su jedanput vidjeli da je situacija u Jugoslaviji sasvim drugčija, a mnogo povoljnija za njih nego što su oni ranije mislili. A s druge strane, međutim, oni su vidjeli da se Draža Mihajlović uporno bori protiv svakog napada na okupatorsku trupu. On nije dozvolio da se napadnu Nemci ni Bugari, a kako znamo, sa Taljanima je vrlo usko sarađivao.
U odnosu na komuniste delila ih je, kao što smo vidjeli, Mihajlovićeva defanzivna strategija nasuprot komunističkoj ofanzivnoj strategiji nezavisno od žrtava, koja se savršeno uklapala u ofanzivnu strategiju koju su formulisale velike sile antifašističkog ratnog saveza. Što je sada tražilo jednu daleko aktivniju ulogu Mihajlovića, koju od njega traže, gotovo imperativno zahtevaju saveznički komandanti na Bliskom istoku. Podsjetio bi na zahtjev generala Aleksandera da počnu akcije u dolini Morave, da počnu sabotaže na mostovima, na vijaduktima, da počnu napadi na nemačke transporte.
Basil Davidson became head of the Yugoslav desk in Cairo in late October 1942. And he became head of the Yugoslav desk with this explicit task of making good Britain's ties to Mihajlović. The irony of his position was that he found himself in receipt of information which indicated that Mihajlović, far from being the man who Britain should back, was in fact doing virtually nothing against the Axis powers. He was therefore the man who was in place when policy was changed and when the decision was made to make the first overtures towards the partisans.
I think that the way in which Tito managed to deceive Churchill was not through direct communication, but from Tito to Churchill and from Churchill to Tito, but always via the liaison officers. And the liaison officers themselves were often briefed in their Cairo base and later on from Bari by a group of people in a secret service called the SOE, Special Operations Executive, whose special job all over Europe was to maintain contact with the resistance organizations. And the SOE, as we now know from many biographies and studies and reports, was infiltrated by one or two very important communists and fellow travelers, people who may or may not have been actually members of the party, but certainly wanted the future to be with a progressive communist side and regarded the Chetniks and the royal leadership and the Yugoslav government as forces from the past that had to be defeated. And this, I think, colored the briefing which they gave to, and which ultimately came to London, and from which Churchill, unknowingly, because of course he was a million miles away from being a communist, unknowingly he was briefed by them, and this was how he was deceived.
Mihajlovićeve snage nisu bile u suštini jugoslovenske snage, jer on nije imao pristalica u Hrvatskoj, a i te njegove pristalice u Sloveniji su više nego simbolične, grupisane oko plave garde pod majorom Karelom Novakom. Ima pristalica u historiografiji, naročito stranoj i emigrantskoj, koji imaju jednu univerzalnu formu da objasne ovu politiku odbacivanja Mihajlovića pod vidom takozvane teorije zavere ili teorije konspiracije koju su komunisti stvorili u organizaciji SOI. Mi nesumnjivo pridajemo značaj materijalima koje je objavio prvi Martin David. Zapisnike iz kojih vidimo i neke četničke akcije na tlu Srbije u jesen 1943. koje jugoslovenska historiografija nije uzimala do sada u obzir. Reč je o tim operacijama oko Prijepolja, operacije vezane za Višegrad i reč je o nizu tih sabotaža manje obima na mostovima, komunikacijama i drugim putevima od značaja za Nemce. I mi tome pridajemo jedan faktografski značaj koji je nesumnjiv. Ali ne možemo u poređenju između borbenih efekata partizanskog i četničkog pokreta nikako prihvatiti tezu da su ti borbeni efekti Mihajlovića u jesen 1943. godine bili veći od partizanskih.
It's always difficult for a professional historian to argue with or comment on the theories of those people who are ardent believers in the existence of a conspiracy. And a conspiracy, of course, is always a very simple way of explaining historical developments. The way in which history unfolded in Yugoslavia in the course of the Second World War was hardly simple, hardly straightforward, and it seems to me those people who would put their faith in the notion of there having been some great conspiracy, a conspiracy masterminded by secret communist moles in the British Intelligence Service, in the Special Operations Executive, or in the British Foreign Office, or perhaps even in 10 Downing Street itself, are making things vastly more simple than they, in fact, actually were. There is, on the other hand, a useful service which is being rendered by the revisionists who are currently at work rewriting the history of Yugoslavia in the Second World War, and that is they are focusing our attention on certain of the dubious areas, areas where it's apparent that decisions were made in a hasty manner, perhaps in a manner which was not actually as much based on facts as it ought to have been, and a manner in which decisions were occasionally railroaded through without full consideration having been given. So I'm not disparaging of the efforts of these people, but it does seem to me that they simplify things altogether too much, and history is hardly ever as simple as they would like us to believe.
The decision was taken for military reasons. But there are those who have said that it was taken for political reasons, and that in some way or other communist influences in Cairo caused this decision to be taken. That, of course, is complete nonsense, absolutely untrue. There is not any truth in that at all. Consider the facts. Who took the decision? The decision was taken by Prime Minister Churchill. It was carried out by Brigadier Keeble, a very, very conservative British soldier. And the orders were carried through by me, who was completely apolitical, had no politics at all. Simply was a serving officer. So these ideas, which go back even to Rebecca West in 1946, 47, were trying to find a way of explaining that the British had betrayed the Chetniks because of communist influence. That is completely untrue, complete nonsense. There is not any truth in that at all, nor could there have been. People say, but there was Lieutenant Klugman, a communist, in SOE Cairo. That is true. He was a lieutenant. But in the British Army, and I think it is the same in the Yugoslav Army, decisions of that kind are not taken by lieutenants.
Mr. Kemp, coming to Cairo.
Yes.
As a young officer, as lieutenant,
Captain.
was it so?
Captain.
Captain, to undertake some new endeavors in SOE, you met James Klugman, and you was astonished. Why was so?
Well, I met him as soon as I walked into the office in Cairo, our office, and I was astonished because before I was recruited into SOE in London, I and all the other brother officers that I knew, we all had to sign a written declaration that we had never belonged to any communist or fascist organization, which I did because I hadn't. Now, Klugman, when I met him at the Cambridge University in 1936, had been the secretary of the Cambridge University branch of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And as you probably know, he went on to become a member of the Politburo. Now, I couldn't understand how, in view of the declaration I had to make, Klugman, a confessed communist, was in SOE and in a very intelligent, a very sensitive post as intelligence officer for the Balkans. I just didn't understand it.
Did your mission in Albania had to do something with it?
I'm sorry?
Did your mission in Albania
Yes.
had to do something with it?
No, Krugman was mostly concerned with Yugoslavia at the beginning, but later on he did come to have quite a lot of influence in the Albanian section. And there were two people with him who more or less followed his direction. I don't think there's any point in giving you their names, but they were also British officers. And as a result, the prejudice against the monarchists or the Balkan Patah, which is the Republican Party, was very strong. And the communists seemed to have the, how shall I say, the ear of the office in Cairo.
So how was it possible at all?
How is it possible? I just don't know. Because don't forget, I was a very junior officer. My work was entirely in the field in Albania and not in the office. I simply don't know how these people became so influential. I don't want to mention any names, but there were one or two who were, if not card-carrying communists, they were what we used to call in those days fellow travelers.
May I mention the names?
Tricky one, this. I don't want to end up in court, a libel action.
Well, there's no doubt at all that inside the Special Operations Executive mission in Cairo, there were ardent proponents of both the Mihailovich and Tito causes. And ultimately, of course, as everybody now knows, those people who felt that vastly more good could be done for the British war effort, and perhaps vastly more good could be done for the future happiness of Europe generally, could be accomplished by supporting the partisans rather than Mihailovich. It's well known that these people ultimately won the day. And the names that we associate with this turnaround in SOE Cairo are, of course, as you mentioned, Basil Davidson, Brigadier Keeble, and James Klugman. Well, nowadays a tremendous amount of attention is being focused on the supposed role of the communist mole James Klugman in the making of British policy. So far as I have been able to determine from the SOE files, James Klugman's role was marginal in the extreme, or at least it was marginal in the extreme prior to the time that he and the Cairo, he and the Yugoslav desk were moved from Cairo to Bari in southern Italy. At that point, Klugman starts having a function which might actually have given him, as a convinced communist, some scope for doing the sorts of things in terms of doctoring intelligence that he's been accused of doing. Before the spring of 1944, I see no possibility for him to have been anything other than one of the cheerleaders in Cairo for the ardent band of people who believed that vastly more good work could be done by supporting the partisans than by continuing British affiliation with and support for Mihailovich.
I did a research for Mr. Churchill later when I was promoted to a senior advisor, on which was killing most Germans, Tito or Mikhailovich. Well, the young intelligence officers who were answering and discussing the whole thing all the time, they had no idea what they were talking about, any more than we did. But I had to work as if I was a German from their point of view only. I didn't know there were SOE officers in the field, nothing like that. I had to work entirely from the German point of view. And studying their material, I was given 48 hours in which to decide which was killing most Germans. That was Churchill's question. And I could only list that the Germans appeared to think there were 11 different fighting factions, most of them fighting each other, but causing some damage to the Germans. And it appeared that Galen, who was the Fremdeherr Ost, the head intelligence officer on the Russian front, he used to send out a splendid summary every day, which we read, and he thought that Tito was the most dangerous at that time.
In supposing that there could have been some kind of plot. Now, if you want to believe there was some kind of plot which caused the War Cabinet and Mr. Churchill to ignore all the information that they had from Ultra and from Enigma and take a decision for political reasons influenced by the communists. My dear sir, in that case you have taken leave of your senses. This decision was taken by Churchill and the War Cabinet in London, and it was taken for military reasons.
This is the Prime Minister's room in the underground cabinet war rooms in the heart of central London. This sparsely furnished little office bedroom was used by Winston Churchill throughout the Second World War as a refuge against German air attacks. It was from this room that Churchill made several of his famous wartime broadcasts. You can see the microphones on this desk here. And it was in this room that Churchill, often working very late at night, formulated his own ideas about the conduct of this country's war policy, including its policy towards Yugoslavia. The underlying objective of British policy towards Yugoslavia during the Second World War had been to encourage the resistance forces in Yugoslavia to tie down as many German combat divisions as possible. Dr. Anne Lane of the Imperial War Museum has closely studied the evolution of British policy towards Yugoslavia. And first of all, why did Churchill take such a close personal interest in events in Yugoslavia?
Churchill had an idea for a campaign in the Balkans, i.e. pressing up underneath the German forces through the soft underbelly of Europe, and he hoped to exploit the Yugoslav resistance forces to that end.
In what ways did Churchill's ideas on Yugoslav policy differ from those of Anthony Eden and the Foreign Office?
It was essentially a question of timing. The Foreign Office, and Eden in particular, wanted to retain their aid to Mikhailovich and Chetniks. Churchill, on the other hand, was very keen to abandon the British mission to Mikhailovich and to transfer all aid exclusively to Tito and partisans.
Poznavaoci Churchillovog dela I ličnosti slažu se barem u jednoj stvari. Bio je to čovek gvozdene odlučnosti. Odluke nije donosio na prečac, ali je veoma dugo mislio o njima, kinjio svoje saradnike do iscrpljenja, čeprkajući po delovima problema koji ga je zanimao. Ali kad bi odluka bila jednom donesena, nije bilo načina da je ne sprovede. Bez ostatka, često I po svaku cenu. Tako je bilo I povodom situacije u Jugoslaviji, to jest njegove odluke da napusti generala Mihajlovića I potpuno se okrene Titu.
All through the war, Churchill had masses of information, but it was a very big war, and he had to be concerned with very many things. He could not concentrate for long on any one part of the war. But it is clear that his attention was fixed on Yugoslavia from January 1943 as a result, I'm sure, of his meeting in Cairo, his friend and collaborator before the war in writing his books, of William Deakin. Because clearly, you can read a lot of information, but if a friend comes to you and draws your attention to part of it, you become much more firmly fixed on it.
And Churchill, who was an impulsive man, he didn't spend a great deal of time thinking about Yugoslavia. He had other bigger matters on his mind, like winning the war. But in the little time that he did concentrate his mind, he was immensely impressed. And as the reports of their fighting and the reports of the number of German divisions they were able to pin down, and these tremendous reports of German offensives, he thought these are, and he described them himself as gallant guerrillas. And this pleased him and satisfied his adventurous spirit. But I think it couldn't have happened like that had it not been for an extraordinary coincidence, one of those curious things in history where people happen to come together at particular moments. And what happened was that both the men who were sent as our officers leading the liaison with the partisans and who were accredited to Tito's headquarters, first went Bill Deakin, who had worked as a historian for Churchill and whom Churchill liked and respected. And he, as he says in his book, I don't know whether you have read his book, but it's called The Embattled Mountain, and he found it tremendously exciting to be exposed in this way for the first time in his life, very close to a guerrilla leader. And he says in his book, from that moment on, the moment when he shared the dangers side by side with Tito, he was captured body and soul by the partisan cause. So that was very important. But even more important was that later on, he was a captain, but the brigadier who came, his senior, was another friend of Churchill's and a very brave, adventurous friend and an excellent writer, Fitzroy Maclean. And Fitzroy had a great deal of influence.
Osim svog političkog iskustva, ličnog Čerčilovog poverenja i pozicije šefa vojne misije kod Tita, Maclean je imao i dobru parlamentarnu poziciju. Kao poslanik za okrug Lancaster ovde u engleskom parlamentu. To je imalo naročitu težinu u pripremi javnog mnjenja ratnog parlamenta za Čerčilove energične odluke koje će uslediti. Započinje tako nova britanska politika na Balkanu.
When I arrived in Cairo with a signals unit from England, we were responsible for the British liaison officers who were already in the field with Mihailovic and with Tito. And the signal station then was outside Cairo. And the officers had normally a wireless operator who had gone into Yugoslavia with them. And they had a portable wireless set with a portable charging battery, so they could operate their wireless sets directly back to us at the Cairo signal station. Each British officer had his individual signal plan. This was my job. From my knowledge, when Fitzroy Maclean parachuted into Yugoslavia, he refused to, as he explains himself in his own book, Eastern Approaches, to use the SOE signals. And he, in fact, had a private a private wireless link between Tito, or his own headquarters in Yugoslavia, to Cairo and eventually to Bari, because the whole signals operation moved from Cairo to a more modern signal station in Bari, where we all transferred in January 1944. But Maclean, during this period, never used the SOE signals.
Brigadir Fitzroy Maclean imao je direktnu vezu sa premijerom Čerčilom. Da bi došao sa njim u vezu, nije mu trebalo ništa drugo nego da iz Kaira, recimo, okrene jedan od ovih telefona u glavnoj telefonskoj sobi u ratnom kabinetu Winstona Čerčila i da ga dobije na telefon. Ovo je jako važna stvar. Dakle, nije morao niko da posreduje u ovom njihovom kontaktu. U jednom od tih razgovora seća se Maclean da je po pravilima iz telefonske knjige Londona rekao dobar dan, ovde je Fitzroy Maclean, na što mu je s druge strane žice glas odgovorio ne, ovde je tikva, a ti si dinja. Pumpkin to Pippin. Onda je shvatio naravno da se radilo o kodiranom razgovoru, o šifrovanom razgovoru, ali je ipak saopštio da ima jako važne vesti iz Jugoslavije, da bi morao doći u London da sa premijerom razgovara lično. Taj razgovor lično i obavljen i u tom razgovoru, između ostalih stvari, između lucidnih zapažanja o ratu u Jugoslaviji i o situaciji na frontu u tom delu Evrope, Fitzroy Maclean, kao iskusan diplomata, političar, rekao je premijeru i neke druge opaske.
Earlier that summer, I'd been entrusted by Mr. Churchill with the command of the British military mission to the partisans. My instructions were to report on the military situation and make recommendations as to how resistance could best be intensified. Tito in those days was a shadowy figure as far as the outside world was concerned. Some people said he was a committee, others a handsome young woman, others that he didn't exist at all. I found a tough, determined, middle-aged man who, with no outside help, had built up from nothing not just a scratch guerrilla force, but a formidable political and military machine. With this, he was containing upwards of a dozen enemy divisions, and I myself had no doubt at all that after the war, he and his followers would take power in Yugoslavia and set up some kind of a communist regime. As a personality, I found Tito much easier to get on with than most communists I'd met in Russia and elsewhere. He made no secret of being a communist. On the contrary, he gloried in it. But for a communist, he was surprisingly ready to see both sides of a question and to take a decision there and then without reference to higher authority. He struck me as being perfectly sure of himself, a principal rather than a subordinate. There were other unexpected things about him. An unusual breadth of outlook and independence of mind, a readiness to see both sides of a question, a never-failing sense of humor. Even in those grim days, an unashamed delight in the minor pleasures of life, and finally an intense national pride which he shared with every single one of his followers. Such was the general sense of the reports that I sent to Mr. Churchill. As to the eventual character of the regime, I emphasize that much would depend on Tito, and whether he saw himself in his former role of Comintern agent or as the ruler of an independent Yugoslavia. It was on the strength of these reports that the British government decided to give all-out help to the partisans, something, by the way, that they certainly were not getting from the Russians.
Što se tiče izveštaja Bakrelovog, mislim da je to jedan briljantan izveštaj. On je ne jedan, nego nekoliko izveštaja napisao, koji pokazuju njegovo duboko političko razumevanje i poznavanje situacije. Svakom preporučujem da čitate izveštaje koje su kod nas objavljeni, ali ti izveštaji nisu nikako bili frizirani, nego su samo pokazali činjenično stanje. Ja ne mogu pomoći o tome da Draža Mihajlović nije nikad ispalio metak, nijedan metak protiv Nemca. To je njegova krivica.
Izvodi iz izveštaja brigadira Fitzroya McLeana o partizanskom pokretu u Jugoslaviji od 6. novembra 1943. godine. Vojna i politička struktura koju su Tito i njegove pristaše izgradili niz čega u 2 godine, bez pomoći iz inostranstva na teritoriji koju je neprijatelj okupirao, impresivna je. Najnovija informacija govori da postoji 26 divizija, a ukupan broj vojnika je 220.000. Već gotovo 2 meseca partizani kontrolišu ostrva i velike delove obale, ali se ta prilika do sada vrlo malo ili uopšte nije iskoristila. Nema nikakvih znakova klasnih borbi. Brojne političke i vojne vođe pokreta potiču iz imućnijih klasa i postoji jaka grupica inteligencije, uključujući brojne stručnjake iz područja tehnike. I mnogi redovni oficiri su se pridružili partizanima, neki pošto su se razočarali u generala Mihajlovića. Za razliku od njihovog stava prema strankama i organizacijama koje su prišle njihovom narodnom frontu protiv sila osovine, partizani se kunu na večnu mržnju prema Nediću, Paveliću, Mačeku i Mihajloviću. Podupirući svog ministra vojske, Jugoslovenska kraljevska vlada ili vlada izdajica i dezertera, kako ih zovu u vlastitoj zemlji, zaslužila je istu mržnju koja se gaji prema samom Mihajloviću.
It was a big overall study of the partisan war effort, and he sent it directly to London, where it was read, and it was so powerful, and he's a very good writer, that it was called a blockbuster. It became known as Fitzroy McLean's blockbuster. But if you look into it, the things he said about the way the partisans behaved, if you go back to those areas and find out how they behaved, is grotesque. And also the claims that he made, the killing of huge numbers of Germans, I can't remember exactly the figures, and it was really based entirely on disinformation, which was very much to the advantage of Tito and the partisans and had an enormous impact. And I think that Fitzroy Maclean must take a lot of responsibility for the subsequent decision that Britain and Churchill and the British government were to take.
Kraj izveštaja brigadira Fitzroya Macleana o partizanskom pokretu u Jugoslaviji od 6. novembra 1943. godine. Vlada njegovog veličanstva može izabrati između sadašnje politike, dok budu okolnosti dopuštale da se otprilike ista materijalna pomoć daje partizanima i Mihajloviću, ili pak da se odbaci Mihajlović i pruži iskrena podrška partizanima. Ne može biti govora o pomirenju ili o podeli zemlje na dve sfere uticaja. S obzirom na vojnu efikasnost, očito se ne može povući poređenje između partizana i četnika. Partizani su između 10 i 20 puta brojniji, beskrajno su bolje organizovani, bolje opremljeni i imaju bolju disciplinu. Gledajući u budućnost, razlozi za iskrenu podršku partizanima jednako su jaki. Izgleda da ne postoji sumnja da bi jedino velika oružana intervencija mogla sprečiti da partizani preuzmu vlast u Jugoslaviji, čim Nemci budu konačno isterani. U stvari, oni već uspešno kontrolišu velika područja. Osim toga, mogu računati na snažnu podršku naših sovjetskih saveznika. Kada bismo napustili Mihajlovića i istovremeno bitno povećali materijalnu pomoć partizanima, ne bismo samo pomagali jugoslovenski doprinos ratnim naporima saveznika, već bismo na čvrstoj osnovi uspostavili anglo-jugoslovenske odnose koji bi silno koristili učvršćenju našeg položaja na Balkanu posle rata. U tim okolnostima dajem sledeće preporuke. Da se prekine podrška Mihajloviću, da bitno povećamo pomoć partizanima, da se posebno, bez daljeg odlaganja, organizuje efikasan sistem snabdevanja morskim putem u velikim razmerama, da se napadaju iz vazduha prikladni ciljevi u Jugoslaviji kad god je to moguće, da emisije BBC-a i drugo publikovanje budu na liniji politike vlade njegovog veličanstva.
Ob die Berichte selber in jedem Punkt richtig sind oder nicht, ist eine zweite Frage. Aber Churchill hat diese Berichte bekommen und das war die Basis für seine Entscheidungen. Und ich glaube, daran kann kein Zweifel bestehen. Und auch wenn ich an die deutschen Dokumente denke und was in ihnen steht, würde ich auch meinen, dass die Tito-Bewegung als die gefährlichere Bewegung eingeschätzt worden ist, mit einer Ausnahme. Mit der Ausnahme, dass es tatsächlich zu einer alliierten Landung an der Adria gekommen wäre, was Hitler eine Zeit lang ja sehr befürchtet hat. Und vor dem Hintergrund dieser Furcht hat er teilweise die Chetnici als gefährlicher eingestuft. Aber die Militärs, die im jugoslawischen Raum eingesetzt waren, haben schon sehr, sehr früh die Tito-Bewegung als den wichtigeren Gegner empfunden.
We did have a different sort of information, sources of information, which enabled us to make judgments independently of what SOE people were getting from the various groups to which they were accredited, with whom they were working. And this was the interception and deciphering of enemy ciphers, above all German ciphers. So that whatever the truth might be about the efficiency of either Tito or Mihajlović, we knew what the Germans thought about Tito and Mihajlović. And we knew that the Germans, who were the people we were concerned about, we knew that the Germans were more worried by Tito's operations and by Mihajlović's operations. To that extent, therefore, Tito was a better bet for us. I think in retrospect you can say that probably during the war and after the war there was a certain tendency to be romantic about partisan movements and perhaps somewhat to exaggerate their achievements.
An sich hätten die Westmächte natürlich lieber eine bürgerlich-nationalistische Partisanenbewegung gehabt, denn die Kommunisten waren ihnen ja nie sehr sympathisch. Aber sie mussten feststellen, dass die kommunistische Partisanenbewegung effektiver und stärker war und haben dann sich stark darauf konzentriert mit ihren Hilfsmitteln Das kann man sagen, das war eine rein pragmatische Entscheidung. Wer ist der stärkste Gegner der Deutschen, den werden wir noch weiterhin unterstützen.
Mogu odmah reći da je moralna podrška bila važna, već istoliko što su nam po koji avion donosio municiju ili koje oružje, koje u stvari ništa nije značilo za naoružanje naših trupa. Ali je moralna vrednost bila itekako jaka, jer se kod nas stanovništvo uverilo da mi nismo sami, da imamo neku podršku izvana, da nam avioni donose i nešto hrane, i municije, i uniforme, i oružja.
But I'd like to add another thing, which is that I think there is an inclination here to exaggerate the importance of the change of policy. I don't believe, frankly, that that was the reason why the partisans won the Civil War. It helped him, there's no doubt. Tito was very much helped in his struggle by the political and material military support. But far more important was, first of all, the fact that Tito himself was a much more able and a much more ruthless and cynical leader, and much better charismatic personality to get people loyal to him, to fight with him, than the poor old Mihajlović turned out to be. He was absolutely outclassed politically.
Rat je imao jednu svoju dijalektiku i Tito je mnogo bolje razumeo tu svoju dijalektiku, a s druge strane, znate, on je bio jedan revolucionar koji je želeo da iskoristi šansu svoga života, želeo da iskoristi pobedu svoga pokreta, želeo da osvoji vlast i tu šansu nije propustio. I kao revolucionar on se nije libio žrtava. Jer šta to za Boga znači u funkciji osvajanja vlasti? I on je sa tog stanovišta za beskompromisnu borbu. Jer to se uostalom vidi jednom najglobalnijom analizom, uvidom u opšte zbivanje, vidi se na osnovu nemačkih depeša, vidi se na osnovu, ako hoćete, i engleskih izveštaja Macleana i drugih. Kad sam već spomenuo Macleana, njega uzimaju kao neku vrstu zlog duha. Smatraju da je on precenio partizanske snage. Šta je posredi? Ja mislim da je Čerčil preuzeo tu politiku od proleća 1943. godine u svoje ruke. I da on radio preko svoje lične diplomatije, zaobilazeći oficijelne resore. Radio je preko Macleana, čovjeka koji je izvanredno poznavao komuniste, čovjeka koji je bio sekretar poslanstva Velike Britanije u Moskvi 1938. koji je prisustvovao procesima na kojima je Stalin skidao glave svojim protivnicima, čovjeka koji je tvorac onog poznatog memoranduma kako treba razvaljivati SSSR preko Kavkaza i preko srednjoazijskih republika, koji je služio kao operativna osnova britanskoj politici mnogo godina i kasnije. Dakle, jedan čovjek koji je najmanje naivčina, koji se ne da tako lako prevariti, čovjek najvišeg poverenja i čovjek koji savršeno poznaje komunista. Drugi čovjek je opet čovjek Čerčilovog poverenja, Dikin. On će kasnije uputiti kod Tita i svoga sina Randolfa. Postoji li veći izraz lične diplomate?
Because as time passed, the British became more and more involved in Yugoslav affairs. The less the Yugoslav government did, the more the British did. The sort of perceived political void was jumped into by the British Foreign Office when they saw that the Yugoslavs weren't doing very much, weren't managing to cohere and come up with a program. British were rather inclined to take a paternal attitude and come up with the program for them, or come up with suggestions for them. So that the more the British became involved, the less they felt that the Yugoslavs needed their own communications. They didn't feel it was a problem. So that in a sense, Mihajlovic's accusation, which he made in 1943, that the British were keeping King Peter and the government in exile prisoners, I think in a sense, in a communications sense, this was true. The British had the control of them. They could hold back messages which they didn't like the sound of, or only hand them over when it was rather late and it was too late to do anything about them. And they seemingly had no scruples at all about doing this, which is, I suppose one has to put it down to the needs of war. But certainly, as far as communications go, the British certainly had total control of King Peter and his government. When Puric became Prime Minister, he was obviously, saw himself as a new broom, and he wanted to make an impression, make a statement, and obviously it was long overdue that someone did make a statement after Jovanovic's inactivity. But to Churchill, the Yugoslav government by this stage was already seen to be a very unimportant thing. Churchill's feelings by this stage were that the only hope for getting any sort of settlement in Yugoslavia revolved around an agreement with Stalin. British power had reached as far as it was going to reach. There was no question of the British taking on the situation in the Balkans single-handedly, so that whatever was done there had to be done in agreement with the Russians. And obviously the Russians had made a big claim to be interested in Yugoslavia. They had supported the partisans by propaganda and worldwide publicity for a year or so already at this stage. And there was no question of either ignoring that or going against it, unless the British were prepared to fight, which they were incapable of doing. I think it was unrealistic of Puric to expect any solution to Yugoslavia's problems which did not involve international agreement, which did not involve Churchill and Stalin agreeing on what was to be done there.
Posle Čerčilovog povratka iz Teherana u London, javnost je već bila spremna za zaokret u Jugoslaviji, što je tek kasnije bilo formalno izneseno pred parlament. Draži više nije bilo spasa.
The Prime Minister decided to abandon Draža Mihailović and ordered that this should be done by December 31st, 1943, and that the King Peter should be persuaded to associate himself with the decision. That order was given after a meeting on 10th December 1943 in the Prime Minister's room in Cairo, when he returned from Tehran and when he was not at all well. At the meeting were Brigadier General Maclean and Colonel Deakin, and also Ralph Scrine Stevenson. Now this is important. Ralph Scrine Stevenson was the ambassador to the Royal Yugoslav government in Cairo. But he was one of the worst enemies of the government's Minister of Defense, Mihailović, and he worked throughout that period to obtain the decision to abandon Mihailović and to support Tito. He was perhaps the strongest supporter that General Maclean had in Cairo. It is important to record that at that meeting there was no representative of the British liaison officers with General Mihailović, nor were the American liaison officers with General Mihailović available there. The British Foreign Office had intended that Brigadier Armstrong and Colonel Bailey from General Mihailović, and also Colonel Seitz, the American, would come out and take part in the discussions which would then take place with General Maclean, Colonel Deakin, and then the decisions would be taken what to do in Yugoslavia. This did not take place. The Prime Minister's meeting only included the representatives from the British mission with Tito, together with Stevenson. From the time the Brigadier Maclean parachuted to Tito's headquarters on, I think, 17th September 1943, we on the Mihailović side received virtually no supplies at all. When Maclean was sent to Tito and Brigadier Armstrong was sent at the same time to Mihailovic, the Foreign Office policy was that they would each come out and report, and that in the meantime 50-50 would be the division of supplies. In fact, I have seen signals which show that the partisans were receiving all the supplies from that period on, and that after Maclean's first dinner with Tito, we were informed by signal that the move of the airport to Bizerta, the bad weather, the ill pilots, the broken aircraft would prevent us receiving any supplies. I would not wish to in any way denigrate the work of the partisans in the anti-Axis struggle. What I am trying to do is to put history in the correct perspective and see fairness done to the Serbian people.
Kada je reč o sudbini Mihajlovića i odnosima Mihajlovića sa Britancima, čini mi se da je važno istaći 3 mesta koja mogu izgledati kao opšta, ali koja ipak imaju jedan korelativni odnos bez kojih se sama njegova konkretna sudbina ne može razumeti. Jedno od tih opštih mesta tiče se same internacionalizacije jugoslovenskog problema. Radi se o jednoj pojavi da je vlada sa kraljem već od 27. marta zarobljenik ili talac britanske politike. Drugi moment koji mi se čini veoma značajan za sudbinu Mihajlovića 1943. da je vezan za početak njegove demistifikacije. Čovek koji je u svetskim anketama u Americi izbijao na prvo mesto pre generala MacArthura i sovjetskog maršala Timošenka, odjednom više nije suvereni antifašistički borac, javljaju se mrlje, postavlja se pitanje kolaboracije njegovih komandanata. Jučerašnji heroj odjednom počinje da se nalazi u uzmicanju. Dojučerašnji Charles de Gaulle počinje da se tretira kao admiral Darlan. Treći moment je vezan za onaj vojno-politički kontekst događaja s jeseni 1942. koji otvara mediteransko ratište, a to znači posle završetka borbi u Tunisu, znači da će se to ratište preneti na jug Evrope. I sada, šta se to zbivalo te sudbonosne jeseni 1943. godine, kada je Čerčil konačno otkačio Mihajlovića? Ja mislim da je samo formalno obrazloženje da su borbeni efekti partizanski bili veći od Mihajlovića. Oni su nesumnjivo bili veći. Mislim da to nije bitno za Čerčilovu odluku. Ja mislim da je bilo mnogo važnije da se na neki način uspostavi veza sa drugim pokretom, partizanskim, da se ovaj stavi pod neki vid kontrole, da se uspostavi neka vrsta ravnoteže između Britanaca i Rusa, da se na neki način omekšaju komunističke sumnje da su svi Britanci a priori protivnici komunistima, narodno-oslovačkog pokreta. Igrajući na kartu Tita uz podršku Moskve, Čerčil je računao da će istovremeno onemogućiti budući građanski rat u srpskom prostoru, jer su četničke snage nesumnjivo bile nadmoćnije, bez obzira na buđenje narodno-oslobodilačke borbe u proleće, leto i jesen 1943. Ali, igrajući na kartu partizana, omekšanih, razume se, koji sada dolaze pod neki uticaj preko pomoći, preko dobijanja naoružanja, preko uspostavljanja mostova, preko Jadrana, slanja svojih obaveštajaca, dolaska misije kod vrhovnog štaba, oni na taj način mogu biti kontrolisani, mogu biti posredno usmeravani i u krajnjoj liniji, kada sovjetski frontovi dosegnu Karpat i Dunav, neće se naći u Srbiji sa snagama Mihajlovića, nego sa partizanskim snagama i izbeći se jedan građanski rat koji bi mogao da bude jedan fitilj, da poremeti odnose među saveznicima u okviru antifašističke koalicije.